So a couple years ago, back before we had any kids, Stephen and I traveled across the country along, I think it was Interstate 70, and we made several stops. And one of the stops that we made was in Birmingham, Alabama. It was at the Civil Rights Museum, and that was really, it was this profound spiritual experience for me because we stopped, and as we went through the different displays, I realized something that I never realized before, and that was what I shared during the children's moment, that the civil rights movement was really a movement that started in the church. And as I went through that museum and as I looked at the different displays, I just had this sense that, these were my people. Sure, they weren't necessarily a part of my denomination, but these were my people. These were people who were seeking to follow Christ, who were seeking to live out his life. And then we made our way across from the museum. We made our way over to the church there on 16th Avenue where the explosion occurred, where 4 African-American girls were killed on a Sunday morning. And there's this famous stained glass window there of Jesus on the cross there. And it was just a time of worship. And I came away from that whole experience changed. And I'd known that the Wesleyan Church had its origins, in the abolition movement, that was why we existed. But it wasn't until visiting that museum and just having that experience that I really started to seek out and wanted to learn more about it. And so this morning, I'm just going to be honest, it's going to be a little bit of a different type of sermon. One of the things that we're focusing on this year is our story. Who are we? Who are we as a church? What are our roots? Where do we come from? In Advent, we focused on, Jesus' roots, Jesus' family story. And it's our family story. So where did we come from? What are our roots? And our roots are deep as a church, as a Wesleyan church. And if you go back to John Wesley in England, who unintentionally left the Anglican Church. John Wesley had some very pointed things to say about slavery. He wrote a huge treatise called Thoughts on Slavery, all about the American slave trade and the evils of slavery. And in it, he talked about how slavery not only damages the soul of the slave, but it also leaves its mark on and damages the soul of those who enslave and on the nation that enslaves. And I think today some of the things that we're seeing played out is that. It's that damage. It's that damage that's been done to our souls as a nation as a result of slavery. John Wesley also, John Wesley was very big on heart holiness. That holiness comes out of our love for God, and that our love for our neighbor, our love for those around us, comes out of our love for God. And that it's impossible to love God and not love our neighbor. And he said this. He said, he described a genuine love for people as a pure, disinterested goodwill to every child of man. A pure, disinterested goodwill to every child of man. In other words, we love others not for what they can do for us, but we just love them in this disinterested sort of love that, that we're not looking to get anything back. We're just holding it loosely and we're just loving, is how John Wesley called people to love. And in July of 1749, Wesley wrote to the inhabitants of Ireland and told them that true Methodists promote love of mankind in every place and seek, and he wrote this, quote, to remove every method of speaking or acting, every temper contrary to love. So this is Methodism. This is our story. This was John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, a church he never intended to start, but he started it. Came to the colonies, and John Wesley's followers, the church that he'd founded, did not take a firm stance against slavery in the years leading up to the Civil War. They were divided like so many other churches across the nation. It's part of the reason why we have the Southern Baptists and the American Baptists, and we have these different denominations, is because denominations were split. Some used the Bible to argue in favor of slavery, others, against it. And there was a group of people within the Methodist Church, within what was then called the Methodist Episcopal Church, a lot of them in New York State, but elsewhere as well, that felt very strongly and struggled for years with this fact that the Methodist Episcopal Church was not, coming down on slavery. In fact, there were preachers and there were ministers within the Methodist Episcopal Church that owned slaves, and they struggled with this. It was this internal struggle for years that they wrestled with, until finally they got to the point in 1843 where they decided to break with the Methodist Episcopal Church. And they had this magazine, and this will give you just some kind of insight into it. It's called The True Wesleyan. Now that word true is very intentional. They were trying to say something with it, The True Wesleyan. And their editor, Orange Scott, who was one of the founders of the Wesleyan Church, one of the founding ministers, wrote this. He said, "We take this step," referring to the separation from the Methodist Church, "we take this step after years of consideration and with a solemn sense of our responsibility to God. The Methodist Episcopal Church is not only a slave-holding, but a slave-defending church. Is there any prospect that this church will ever be reformed so long as slavery exists in the country? We step into the breach. Duty is ours, consequences God's." There was just this, they'd wrestled with it for years, and just this determination and just this decision, we're going to do something. Duty is ours, consequences God's. We're going to leave it. We're going to take action. We're going to leave it in God's hands. And I love this, just to give you some more insight into the early Wesleyans. When they were in their meeting, in their opening meeting there, and after the official call, they outlined the purpose of their meeting. And they said it was to do this. It was to form a Wesleyan Methodist church free from episcopacy. So that some of the bishops in the church had been very heavy-handed. And so if someone spoke out against slavery, whether it was a layperson or whether it was a minister who had strong feelings against slavery, if they spoke out, they were told to hush, or some of them were kicked out, in some places. And so free from episcopacy, it's a hard word to say. But, we're not going to have this heavy-handed thing where these elected preachers, officials, are ruling everything. This is going to be more of a grassroots, loosely connected thing. Free from I'm going to stop saying that word, episcopacy and slavery, and embracing a system of itinerancy where they would go around to different churches. They might have preaching points, and they would go around, and preach like circuits, yeah. They would go around and preach, maybe once a month at different places, so they'd be able to spread the word, and in the meantime, it was the people in those places that would keep the church running. It wasn't the pastors, it was the people in those places. And I think we sometimes forget that. We think, it's the pastor that leads the church. It's the pastor that keeps things running. Well, in this case, it was the people. And that's part of the Methodist system. That's part of our Methodist heritage. That's part of what John Wesley set up. He set up these class meetings, and there were lay people, who were the class leaders and who would check on people throughout the week, and they were the ones that really kept things running. And then the ministers, you know, the ordained ministers would travel around and check on people and help with some of the discipleship. But it was the people that were there that kept, that did the work of the ministry, which is really a biblical concept. So embracing a system of itineracy under proper limitations and restrictions with such disciplinary regulations as necessary to preserve and promote experimental and practical godliness. And I love that, experimental and practical godliness. How can we make this work? They didn't have a huge plan, but how can we make this work? And so that's why that's how the Wesleyan Methodist Church came into being. And so, if, like I told the kids, if you go back to some of the very earliest Wesleyan Methodist churches, you will find evidence of the Underground Railroad underneath their buildings in different places. In fact, one historian in his book, The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom, wrote this. He says, "Indeed, it can be said of the Wesleyans, as of the Quakers, that almost every neighborhood where a few of them lived was likely to be a station on the Underground Railroad." They were abolitionists. That's a large part of what defined them. But it wasn't just about the cause. The cause came from something deeper. It came from this love for God and this love for people that came out of their love for God. It was about seeking to live a life of holiness, following the example of Jesus. Here at Hope, we talk about, who is a Christian or what is a Christian? A Christian is someone who's been saved from the penalty of sin, set free from the power of sin, and lives a life of holiness, following the example of Jesus. And what's Jesus' example but this? A life given for others, a life laid down for others. Last week we talked about Jesus' baptism and how he didn't have to be baptized, and yet he did that to identify with us in his humility. And we see here in the early Methodists and the early Wesleyans that same humility, that same laying down of their lives, seeking to love their fellow brothers and sisters, those people that they saw needed help. That many in the church, said, well, no, the slavery is supported by the Bible. And yet we have people standing up and taking a stand. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14, it says this. It says, "For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again." So we've been talking kind of a little bit in abstracts, but I want to make it more personal. There was a group of people in North Carolina who lived kind of in the Piedmont area who they were Methodists. They were Methodist Episcopals, and they got a hold of this pamphlet, and it was published by one of the early Wesleyan pastors in New York State, and somehow they ended up with it. They're probably passing things around, and it was titled, and I think this is significant. It was titled "Love Worketh No Ill to His Neighbor." So very much still in this, in John Wesley's tradition, that love worketh no ill to his neighbor. And some of the people in North Carolina, they got a hold of this, and their pastor saw them reading it, and he came down on them. He told them, "Stop reading that stuff." Well, that just flamed things. That just caused their interest, maybe even casual interest, just to fan into flame. And so after a couple of years, or after, there are about 40 or 50 of them that decided to withdraw from the Methodist Episcopal Church. And they wrote to the Wesleyans up north, and they asked for a preacher. They said, can you send us a discipline, and can you send us a preacher? We want to start a church. And so that request came through, and some of the Wesleyan Methodists were gathered in Ohio, at an annual meeting, and they read the letter, they read the request. The request was put out, and there was a young pastor there who was in his early 20s by the name of Adam Crooks. And after a time of prayer, he answered the call. He stood up and he said, "I'll go." And it says, his face was pale like marble. I mean, this was not an easy decision, because to be a Wesleyan back before the Civil War, was to be an abolitionist. It was to be a radical. To be a Wesleyan was to be a radical in the North. Ideas were not necessarily popular. But in the South, below the Mason-Dixon line, you were a target if you were a Wesleyan. And so Adam Crooks went, and so this was in 1847. And all that winter, he and the others, they worked on this very simple church building that they built called Freedom's Hill, that was started there in North Carolina for the express purpose of freedom for the sinner. That's all of us, right? Freedom for the sinner and freedom for slaves. So you see in that there is this dual purpose. There is this spiritual purpose of heart holiness, freedom for the sinner, and freedom for the soul. There's a social responsibility. And so often we try to separate those two. We try to keep them separate rather than recognizing that those two are very compatible and they spring from the same place. Freedom for the sinner and freedom for the slave. So they started this church called Freedom's Hill there in North Carolina. And Adam Crooks was there. Within the first year, there were 8 preaching points. He'd started 8 churches there in North Carolina and Virginia. Keep in mind, this is the South. So, planting a Wesleyan church in the South, when this is a church of abolitionists, that's dangerous. He was poisoned twice. His effigy, a mock statue of him or whatever, or makeup of him, was tarred and feathered. Ambushes were laid for him that failed because he happened to be with other people rather than by himself. He was dragged from the pulpit. The church was shot up in an effort to intimidate the worshipers and to intimidate him. He was imprisoned. He was barred from speaking on the courthouse grounds in the counties surrounding Freedom's Hill. And in that time, in those first couple years, 2 more ministers came and joined him. But it finally got to the point where it was too dangerous. And so, all 3 of them were imprisoned. All 3 of them were in danger. All 3 of them were targets. But it got to the point where it's so dangerous that all 3 of them had to leave, and they went back up north. And 6-7 years passed. And during that time, they didn't have a pastor. This church, Freedom's Hill, didn't have a pastor. But one of Adam Crooks' converts was a man by the name of Micaiah McPherson, and he was a layperson. I can tell you from reading some things that he used tobacco up until shortly before his death. He's not what we think of necessarily as a church person, but he was one of Adam Crooks' converts, and he and others in the church they kept the church alive. They kept preaching points alive. 6 years later, when a pastor came who was originally from North Carolina, who was a Wesleyan, came down to check on the church and to provide pastoral ministry to them by the name of Worth. They had those people in that church, one of them being Micaiah McPherson, had maintained 20 churches in that area without a pastor on their own for 6-7 years. And they kept things going, kept the Underground Railroad going, stood for their anti-slavery principles, kept things going. And it got to the point where it was too dangerous for that pastor, who was a native to North Carolina, to stay. So he left. And on the eve of the Civil War, as the Civil War is approaching and things are really starting to heat up, some people who were taking the law into their own hands, but were supported by the local authorities, came up and they surrounded Micah McPherson outside his barn. And they informed him that they were going to hang him for his anti-slavery principles. There are some different versions of this story. One version is that they were looking for his son, they were going to conscript and take into the Confederate Army. But again, that's an anti-slavery principle. We don't know, but they were tired of him, and they were going to do away with him. So they took him to this. They saw a tree, and there's a famous quote. But they said this. They said that they reckon that this knotty dogwood tree was good enough to hang a Wesleyan on. And they took the reins of a horse and they put it around his neck. There was a rock kind of underneath the tree, and they put him up on that rock, put it around his neck, and then shoved him off the rock. And he lost consciousness, and at some point he heard horses coming through the creek, and he heard him say, "Well, the rascal ain't dead yet, but we need this noose to go hang another Wesleyan." And they took him down, he dropped to the ground, and he was just there. And it was sometime during the night that he regained consciousness, and he was able to crawl back to the house and to his wife. And he actually lived. He outlived his wife, he outlived his 2 daughters. He lived 30 more years after the Civil War. But those are some examples of what the early Wesleyans lived through, of who they were, of what they stood for, of what they did. And it came from a desire to follow Christ and to be obedient to Christ. It wasn't just about slavery. It was. They saw slavery as contrary to the Bible, as contrary to God. But it was more than that. It was about this deep heart, holiness. In Micaiah, it says this in one of these things are all on the Wesleyan Church's website. You can find all of these different histories. This one's on Micaiah McPherson, but it says this about him. It says, his spiritual life remained rich and contagious. He loved to testify in the church services. Micaiah came to oppose the use of alcoholic beverages as strenuously as he had slavery. He fully supported the holiness revival among Wesleyans, commenting to a Christian friend during his last summer, "The doctrine of entire sanctification is the doctrine of the Bible." Just before his death, he got the victory over the tobacco habit, the last filthiness of the flesh, saying, "I had rather die than to live and use it." His Christian life was a battle and a victory to the very end. Sometimes we think that Christian life is, if I can just get a handle on things, if I can just be perfect, if I can just get things together, then I can go live the Christian life. No. Micaiah McPherson, he lived the Christian life out in the midst of all of these different tensions, in the midst of what was going on in his own life and his own struggles, in the midst of what was going on in the nation, and he sought to be faithful to God in the midst of all of those different struggles and all of those different tensions. That's who we come from, people like Micaiah McPherson. May we be faithful just as they were faithful.